Hello, everyone, and welcome back. This is another episode of Past the Pilot, I think episode 6, with Jonny McFadden and myself, Stefan Morn. Today, we have a really interesting topic, and it's something that we both have been thinking about for a while. And it's really how is agentic bias in AI? So there's always this kind of hidden agenda that you feel the black box that the agent is. Is it really doing that? It's a sycophant, right? It's trying to please me, all of that. So bias in AI and agentic AI, and what can we do about it, right? So how can we address this? So when you think about the kind of way that humans really go into a conversation, let's say in a business context, right? It's really a situation like having a boardroom, and you would have the CFO in there, the VP of product, maybe sales engineers, and each of them has their own sort of hidden agenda. It's something that they have underneath the surface. Of course, it's totally professionally driven, it's collaborative. But underneath, there is something completely different happening. It's sort of a shadow agenda that's running simultaneously, right? And it's really, there's a performance that you see in that meeting, but the real meeting seems to be happening and running silently underneath.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that because it's funny how we're always finding these parallels between AI and humans, which I guess makes sense because it's artificial intelligence, right? But I think we see the same kind of thing, and I guess the way I was thinking about this is, everyone has a hidden agenda because at the end of the day, everyone has in their brain, whether they're aware of it or not, typically you're not aware, there are these evolutionary drives of behavior that are making you pursue things like, more money, more wealth, right? Getting people to
Mhm.
like you, making good impression to your boss. Because if you go back, 100,000 years ago, being outcast from your group of people was a very, very bad thing for your survival. And at the end of the day, everyone's driven by these, you know, crocodile brains or monkey brains or whatever you want to call it, right? That's going to drive a lot of this behavior. And I think what's interesting is since the part of the brain that we're most aware of is the I think it's the neocortex, that human part of the brain. Yep, that rationalizes everything, right? So that's what you're
Mhm.
actually typically like thinking with. I like to think of it like when you hear that voice in your head talking back and forth of why you're doing something, right? That's really rationalizing this really, really old software in your brain that is, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years old,
Right.
and kind of putting a human element into it, which I think is really, really interesting.
And that human software is really our emotions, right?
Yeah.
Which are driven by fear, which are driven by the interest for protection, right? For self-preservation. All of these things really play into that. So it's really like people are not lying, right? But it's sort of their, as you say, their neocortex is sort of rationalizing what the emotions desire. And really this comes down to that whatever is said in the room is yes, it's clearly what the company wants, but the question is what's driving it, right? It's when you, for example, when somebody says we need to optimize this timeline.
Mhm.
It's for the company, it's really deliver on time, but for the person itself means if this slips, my team will look weak,
Yeah.
right? It's sort of these messages that are really the intent of the people to for self-preservation, right? Or when you say we need to form another workshop, another group meeting, right? It's about the company would want shared ownership of something to make sure the process is right, but it's really for the person. I need to maybe dilute the responsibility of a decision that needs to be taken,
Yep.
or what if there's like unclarity about some data points, right? What if the company really wanted to have like that every decision is based in evidence, right? But to the person, it means if this succeeds, then Bob gets a promotion or Johnny gets a promotion, Stefan doesn't,
Yep.
right? So, and this is like these really underlying things where we're picking up on an underlying sort of emotional director that each of us is having in our heads, and in the end, the outcome is different.
And I
So, yeah.
Well, I was going to say, I think what's interesting about it and how it relates, I think, to, the topic of AI bias is, if you think about humans, right, why do we behave the way we behave? Well, we have these things in our head, right, our brains and our biology, but we also have been trained, right, through
Yeah,
growing up,
exactly.
right? You go to a restaurant when you're a kid and you throw a fit and right, your mom pulls you out of the restaurant, your dad pulls you out of the restaurant and teaches you that's not how we behave, right? And that's a very, very basic example, but this type of, training happens all the time. And I think this is what leads humans to be biased. That's why not every human is the same.
Yeah.
Not just because the underlying biology, but the underlying, I think, training and the experiences that they've had up till that point.
And it's really interesting when you go through the world with and you see the world through that lens, right? It's like once you understand that and you have this sort of behavioral lens, how you understand people's motivation, you cannot unsee it. It's like
Yep.
seeing the code in the matrix in a way. So now let's switch this maybe a little bit over to the AI world because people might be saying like, yeah, sure, AI, it's just an algorithm, it's just a forecasting. It's basically we all know AI LLMs are really just like statistical tools in the end, algorithms that predict the next letter, the word, the next sentence. But when you see it from that point of view, the question here that started ourselves when we came to Vertisea is how humans work. But how does this invisible machinery that's running underneath us, what does it mean for agents, right? So because you could argue it's not that different. And
I would argue it's very similar, right? It's very similar. I think you can, one thing I think that can happen with AI agents, since they're kind of an iterative, like looping process with these LLMs, is a small bias or a small mistake can kind of have a snowball effect. And there's obviously ways that we'll talk about in a little bit of kind of handling that. But I think that's where I see it most is the ability, or I guess I would say the function that is the agent making a small mistake and then making a bigger mistake or having a small, right, hidden assumption about something due to its training data of it's going to assume let's take like the date problem that we have, right? These models are only trained up to a certain date, right? So they're always going to
yeah,
assume, unless they're given additional context, they're always going to assume it's, you know, uh, June 16th, 2026, because that was the last day of training,
right.
right?
That's what their memory, what's in their memory, right? That's
Yeah.
what the foundational training of the model. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's these sort of unstated subroutines, right? That really not only drive what's in the memory, but also that how they were trained is really interesting because when you train a model, you try to what's the word to amplification training? No, that's not the word. We have to cut this.
Reinforcement learning.
Reinforcement training.
Yep.
So the way that agents are trained is with by the means of reinforcements, which means like positive behavior is positive, or the right behavior is positive, and the negative outcome will be sanctioned in a way.
Mhm.
So really what that means if the model has a disagreement, it sees lower ratings. And if there's agreement, it will have higher ratings.
Yep.
So, and the directive for the model is minimize the friction, maximize the agreement. And when you come to this where you need to do that across a number of all these data sets, the model starts shifting its behavior. It's almost there's like a subroutine that drives the model towards the right outcome in order to satisfy the requirements. And this is the bias really that's built into all of these models.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you're 100% right. It really comes down to, and I think it's worth talking maybe for 30 seconds about right how the training works. So the LLMs are trained on all the text in the world, all the text you can think of, right? And that gets them kind of to a baseline where they're predicting the next token or word, however you want to think about it, right? And that's really all they're doing. But then what you're talking about is where the bias really starts to come in because while it's biased at that stage, it hasn't actually it's been trained on text in a broad sense, but it hasn't been trained on human preferences, for example, right? And so what you're talking about is, well, now a model that is agreeing with you and that is friendly to you is going to get rewarded more than a model that is unhelpful
That's
or
the word,
aggressive or
rewarded.
whatever,
Yeah.
right? And so it's just reinforcing that behavior. And I think, well, that's good. Right. And so I think in some sense or another, bias is unavoidable both with humans and with AI. But I think you see it can have unforeseen consequences, right? And it's not always easy to know what those consequences are going to be because the biases, just like with humans,
Yeah.
are hidden underneath the surface.
And that behavior can really result in something like you make a totally false premise on the confidence, right? You have a wrong perception of of something that the model is saying because it says it with confidence, when in reality the model just subtly shifted to validate your worldview, right?
Yes.
To support you. And this is really basically it's the AI equivalent of the naysayer in the room, right? That the one that tells the CEO exactly what they want to hear, and them genuinely believing that's right. It's like the story of the king without clothes, right? Where everyone says, "Oh, this is fantastic," and the king believes in it.
Yep.
Um, so these are sort of risk aversion methodologies, I would call them, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I think they're these biases are, I guess, a consequence of trying to make these models more right? Like think about it, right? ChatGPT, for example. Well, that's a user application, and these models need to be uh, conversing with humans in a way that is pleasant to the humans, right? And is agreeable to them. Um, and I think overall that's a good thing, right? We don't want models that are going to be, not grounded in some sort of truth or are, aggressive aggressive towards you in conversation. But I think where it gets really interesting is being able to steer against this bias with some sort of context. So for example, if you prompt a model of, right, I want you to be a harsh critic of what I'm saying, right? That additional context is then going to get fed into that model. And while you're not retraining the whole model, that additional context is helping to steer the algorithm that is producing the next word.
That's an interesting point because that's what people currently believe is going to really help. But we know, but Johnny, from our work, it really doesn't, right? It's
Yep.
shifting it a little bit, but there's a lot of more things going into that. But the basic tendency is to protect the system from liability at all cost, right?
Yes.
That's what we
Yes.
see. That's why the policies are in place. That's why certain prompts are just discarded, or the model will reply and say, like, I cannot generate that kind of image, right? Depending
Yeah.
on what
Yeah.
you're doing. And it's really, and I'll take all of this. It's the middle manager, staying with analogy, right? So this middle manager that never makes a decision because every decision is a potential career risk, right? And
Yeah.
now, right? And now in this enterprise context, for a legal review, for a financial analysis that is risk averse, that's actually the opposite in many cases of what you want to do, because it will not challenge itself, right? It will not be, not saying it's not honest. It's just like it could have a dangerous or disastrous outcome, a wrong answer, in a business enterprise context where it's important to be objective, and the
Yep.
model cannot be objective in itself. So this leads us to this idea of, like, and you mentioned already the context, right? So I can tell the context to behave differently. Okay, through the context window, I can tell the model to behave differently. But as the context window is growing, right, as we know, with every time you hit enter, your previous conversation gets into the model context. The model context, sort of a short-term memory of the conversation, and it keeps filling up. And the more from the beginning, from the get-go, you start a conversation in a certain direction, the more you get this sort of semantic gravity well, where the model starts getting manipulated to think into one direction or to create outputs. Again, these are all just predictive algorithms
Yep.
to predict into a certain direction. And an early framing really dominates. The first exchange that's established as a narrative really dominates what follows up and what gets pulled into the context and subsequent conversation window, right? And
Yeah.
that's really this is what, for example, is called the context rot, right? The context is getting worse and worse and worse. right? Which is really interesting if you look at it. How can you prevent that, right? And the human parallel is really it's what happens when the most senior in the person when the most senior person in the room always speaks first, because everyone will just follow with their alignment, with their bias, and try to go into that direction. That's why at Vertisea we don't necessarily do that. We let whoever begins the meeting as the first speaker, right?
Yep.
So we're trying to take that bias away from ourselves, but also, Jonny, how are we doing that for agentic systems? Because it's a little bit of our credo at Vertisea of how we're handling agentic bias.
Yeah,
Um,
and I think it's interesting because this analogy just kind of keeps keeps working. Right. With you,
Right.
you mentioned a meeting of people. Well, right, the reason that you have a meeting of people is because everyone has a different opinion. Right, and you kind of can fact check each other and bounce ideas off each other. And with Vertesia, the way the agent architecture is set up is it's really, really easy to have multiple agents interacting in a way that's similar to humans. And like the saying, two heads are better than one is very true for agents as well as humans because you're getting you're getting different aspects, and that's going to help eliminate some of the bias overall,
Yeah.
right? Just like with humans, if you have three people, right, all kind of sharing ideas, they're less likely to be biased, and they're more
Yeah.
likely to, I guess, arrive at the decision that you're wanting.
It's
Um,
like reversing that sort of reward hacking,
yes,
right? Where people are, or you might call it fishing for compliments, right? That's just a personal context. In a business or in an AI context, you can make the model do things by giving it the right positive inputs. You're giving it rewards, right? And this is exactly where, as you described, we need to control what goes into the context, or was also what stays in the context, right? By not just like again, as in conversation, by just re-injecting everything from the conversation back into the context, right? You need to take things out. You need to make an assessment what stays in the context that's relevant to further the conversation. Forget about what I just said, in a way, right?
yeah, yeah. Well, it's interesting because there's an agent that I've been playing around with, called I believe we call it expert roundtables or roundtable of experts. And the
Oh
idea is
yeah.
exactly what we're talking about, which is use the way this model or this agent is set up is it takes instruction from a human, and it will split that, or it takes a question, I should say, or a topic, and it splits that into basically competing personalities. And you can either have the agent can either create these personalities based on real world figures, or you can give it right specific ones. You could have, I don't know, Dr. Oz arguing with, I don't know, Dr. Phil, all right, two examples. But you basically have this discussion that goes on, and you can actually see this when this agent's running is these agents are debating back and forth the topic that it was given. And then you have, three, four, five different personalities. You end up coming to a conclusion that's almost more of it takes into account all of the different aspects. And so it essentially, I don't want to say eliminates, doesn't completely eliminate, right? But it very, very much reduces the issue with bias because you have
Oh
one
yeah.
agent saying this, and this other agent is going to argue and say, well, no, that's not true because of XYZ. And then there's a third one. And what's really powerful is there's an orchestration agent at the very top that it almost acts as like the moderator in a debate.
This is the
Um,
speaker. Hmm.
yeah, yeah, that kind of keeps everything on track, right? And then at the very end, all that information is kind of parsed, and a conclusion is given based on the question.
It's really a moderated conversation, as you say, and also each so you can have these different personas with subject matter experts in something, but these can all be represented by different models as well, right? So the difference with saying like, hey, this one LLM create me three different personas and create like a synthesized a simulated conversation, that's something way different here, right? We're
Mhm.
creating different personas on different models, and they have to follow a protocol of how to have a conversation, and that's the orchestrator that you described.
Mhm.
And then they have to follow the rules, right? And then there will be a report, an honest agreement on a disagreement, right? So it's super interesting to see how that works. And there's actually another article down in the comments. There's an article about that on my blog previously. How that really works in detail. It's discussion rounds. It's just like, think of the United Nations, right? Where it's discussion rounds and people taking notes and taking stands about each other's arguments from their point of view, and that's really furthers the conversation. So this is one super important thing that you brought up that really helps. It's a specific feature, specific tool. It doesn't work for everything, but when you need to come to a decision, really, this greatly helps. But you cannot fully take out the bias in such a scenario, right? I mean, there's always a base bias. We just learn how to mitigate that and how to bring it down, right?
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember too that people are also biased, right? I think AI gets a unfair microscope put on it sometimes. Maybe not unfair, but it gets a microscope put to it of, oh, well, it's not always accurate, or oh,
Yeah,
it can make mistakes, or oh, it's biased. And you can say the exact same thing about all the humans, right? Humans make mistakes, humans are biased. And so again, I don't think it's how do we the question isn't how do we train a model so that it has zero bias? The
yeah.
question is how can we architect a system
That's
that's
the
going
point.
right? That's
That's
going
the point.
to reduce
And
the
and
risk.
what we architected into the system with this, we call it the round table feature, is really that we just as Johnny and I and the rest of the people at Vertisea, we keep each other honest. That's the same thing with the round table feature. It is different personas keeping each other honest, right? And that's built into the architecture. But Johnny, we have more means of ensuring that there's less hallucinations, there's better quality outputs. And really thinking of one of our major differentiators to the entire ECM market out there is our semantic doc prep, right? It's our context layer, how we're making sure that the context quality is not just about what the agent knows, it's about what kind of knowledge is allowed to enter into the reasoning window of the agent, right? So it's a precision instrument to fine tune what goes into what the agent knows about. So, what do you think about that? How does semantic doc prep help us with harnessing the agent's bias?
Yeah, no, I think it's an interesting point you bring up, and I think with the semantic doc prep we have, it's it helps ground the agent in accurate context. And what I mean by accurate context is if you take a PDF document, for example, let's say it's a some sort of contract, and there's tables and maybe there's images and there's a bunch of text and there's headers and subheaders and body text and all that, right? Traditionally, how that would get fed in is it's just going to be one long string of text, which means the title and the subheaders and the body text are all treated the same. And there's no, but when you're a human and you're looking at it, you understand the hierarchy. And so what we've done with semantic doc prep is we've used XML to essentially keep that hierarchy in place so that the agent or the model that is looking at this document has an accurate representation. And what we've seen is that greatly reduces, bias hallucinations because the agents and well, I should say the models, it's not that they just randomly make stuff up, right? They will make, quote unquote, make stuff up when they don't have the information that they're being
Right.
asked about.
This
And
is where
they'll just make something
hallucination
up.
begins when there's gaps in the data.
Yep. And so semantic doc prep is a way to make sure there aren't gaps in the data, right? If it has an accurate view of the PDF it's looking at, for example, it's going to be much less likely to make something up about what's in that PDF. Whereas if it hasn't been prepared properly, it's not going to have a good view into what it's looking at. And it's going
I
to,
mean, think about like, and Johnny, you're working on these cases live with our clients, right? Do you have like a 500-page legal document, right? How would the agent decide what is the important parts in there, right? What are the relevant clauses? How do you structure and prioritize that? And that's really what the semantic doc prep of doc preparation of Vertisea really makes sure that there's a structure to it. There's not just like what many people believe, oh, I throw it into a RAG environment, into a RAG indexing vector repository, and that's going to take care of finding the right pieces. No, it will not, because your chunks that are generated by the vector embedding will not necessarily help you with identifying what's the most important piece of information in this 500 pages document, or where the important parts are actually related to each other within the document, right? And this is where semantic doc prep, basically creating like a tree structure, like a document,
Yeah,
like a metadata structure around the document, helps the agent to navigate through the document as it's working on a case.
yeah, yeah.
Incredibly powerful.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
I mean, this is for good reason one of our main differentiator again to any other ECM out there. This is why we can build these so powerful agents really.
Mhm.
Um, but also we have this sort of intelligence layer, Johnny. When I think about that, which is sort of a control plane that sits between the raw LLM capability and what we need to make sure in enterprise deployment, right? And there's a number of different mechanisms for that. And one of them is the thinking tool. And I think you mentioned it in our previous conversations. What is the
Yeah.
thinking tool really doing?
Yeah, the thinking tool is actually my favorite tool that agents have because I think it's really cool where it will you can see it's almost as if you asked a person a question and you ask them to think out loud, right? So instead of internalizing in your head, since it's an LLM and it can produce text, what you'll see is when you ask it a question, it'll use its thinking tool and it'll say, the user is asking me to research, the latest AI trends on the website. What am I going to need to do that? Well, I'm going to need a tool to search the web. I'm going to need to understand what the current day is. And it starts to think through things, and you can actually see everything that it's thinking, which is not only fun to watch, and it's very cool, but it's really useful, right? Because you can validate the assumptions the agent's making. You can actually see if it is making something, a biased decision, right? Or if it's making a miscalculation somewhere in its thoughts, you can see that.
But I think that's right. But I think one of the most important things here is the visibility, as you say. So I can see the thinking, but also it's a separate stream. It's a chain, it's a separate stream of thoughts. It does not contaminate the current conversation that I'm having with the agent. That so it doesn't go back into the context window. The
Mhm.
decision that comes out of the thinking goes into the context window, but not the
Yes.
thinking process. So this is how we take bias out, right? Because in the conversation, I'm able to change that thinking and that sort of structure workflow that follows from that. And this is kind of a second component that we do at Vertisea, where we are enforcing a structured workflow. So it's not just the agent thinking tool comes up with an idea and then it's just doing that. We enforce that there's a plan, right? We go into everything that the agent does is based on the plan, and this plan is based on defined state validations. So it needs to always have a beginning, a planning, an execution, a testing, and a quality assurance at the end. It's an architectural defined edges, you can say.
Mhm.
The agent can choose between different possible logical steps on how to solve a problem. And it can come up with new ways to solve a problem, but it has to follow a plan. And that's really a difference between a system that you can audit and one that you cannot, because you can always rely on the plan on the agent having a plan before it just creates wild output, right?
Yeah, and I think something that is also really, really powerful is that Vertesia has that I don't think I've seen anyone else do is our ability to audit agents with other agents. And so we've built tools that allow agents to see what other agents have done, right? So what the use case where this came about was I was testing an agent and I was kind of doing A/B tests with different prompts and different configurations. And I was using a third agent to monitor their logs. And originally I was downloading the logs and I was uploading them to the platform.
Mhm.
But what we realized is we could just give the agent a tool where the human didn't have to manually download everything and then re-upload it. You could just have this agent look at, right? So the thinking tool we were talking about earlier, you could have an agent go and look and see exactly what this agent was thinking at this point in time. And so this is really useful for things like you can, right, detect, you could have an agent run and detect, specific biases that are happening in the process. You could have an agent run to, right, make things more efficient. So maybe it can analyze the entire agent conversation and it can say, oh, well, it did this in 10 steps, but in reality, it
Yeah.
probably could have done it in 4 if it just did this route, right? And so that's all being done by agents. And so it becomes that's really the value of the platform is what we build can be used to build other things, right? And it's almost this snowball effect of agents helping to build agents, helping to test agents, right? All
Yeah.
resulting in more in better and more capable agents.
And speaking of the value that it means to a company is really when you see how enormously important this is for the enterprise, right? When regulators come in an audit and they say like how did your AI arrive at this recommendation? And there's so many examples out there on the news where people just blindly relied on the outcomes and they took wrong decisions that cost them millions. You need to be able to answer to that, right? Most platforms cannot really do that. And it really feels like in the bigger picture, and why this matters now is that the industry is sort of an inflection point. Agents are being deployed for clinical recommendations, for financial analysis, legal review, strategic planning, you name it. All of the use cases that we're working on for our clients, right? And our clients trust in us because we are able to demonstrate to them that we have the harness, the agentic harness, we have the quality assurance, we have all of these methodologies that we just talked about in place, which is making sure that the cost of this invisible sort of bias is managed at scale. And there's no value in having like sycophant agents that tell our executives what they want to hear. It's just not a productivity tool. It is a liability for the organization.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And I think if you think about just using one single agent for something, right? Um, any that agent will not be perfect, right? The models are never going to be, perfect, meaning they're completely unbiased. And a very small misstep, right, compounds over time. So if you think about,
Yeah.
as you were saying that, I was thinking of this kind of airplane analogy where it's like if you're in an airplane, and you are flying due west, and all of a sudden, without you knowing, the plane is now pointing 1 degree towards the
Oh
north.
my God. Unacceptable.
Yeah, not going to matter for the first 10 feet. But guess what? After you fly 100 miles, 1,000 miles, 10,000 miles, you're going to be in a completely different area. And I think we see the same thing with
Absolutely.
with companies that are trying to do AI in this kind of myopic, singular way. Is it's not going to be, right, just one model to rule them all. It's not going to be one agent to rule them all, right? There's specific, I think, specializations you can do, and there's certain architectures and systems you can build out where you have, multiple agents with multiple models essentially
Yes.
working together to produce the right outcomes and avoiding any bias or risk from that.
Absolutely, Johnny. And actually, it's a inflection point where people now start understanding that there's such a huge risk, and we cannot accept those risks really. If you need to stop thinking industry wide that you cannot pretend that prompt engineering will substitute for architectural integrity. That's just not true. That's the same thing as saying like, yeah, I have Claude Code and I can build an entire platform with it. No, you cannot. Believe me, you cannot. You can create a demo, you can create something that works, but as soon as you go to scale, you need the architect's mind. The same for the field of creativity. Yes, it can create myriads of versions of an image, a video, you name it, but none of that is really good until you have a really creative mind that's driving it, that sits in the director's seat. And the same is true here. Give something just to an LLM and just tell it to do it right, it will not. Is like, I think one of our engineers always says, Antoine, he always says like, yeah, agents, they are like children. If you don't really harness them, they will just go astray. And in the enterprise context, that's not just not acceptable, it's a real liability, it's a real risk that needs to be dealt with, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
So the meeting underneath is what we wanted to unravel today. So it's not just something that's happening with us humans, it's also happening in the world of agents and AI. Vertisea has a number of ways to control that and to limit the outcome of that, and to really make sure that the content that is generated by our agentic platform is meeting all the marks. It's auditable. We can make sure it's been vetted by more than just one model. And it's just a fantastic way of moving things forward. Jonny, thank you so much for your time today. I think this was another great session, and
Yeah.
I can't wait for next week seeing you again. Until then, everyone, thank you so much, and have a good day. Bye, Jonny.
See you later.
Alligator.